senses that he'll be able to survive, but his genitals have a way of kind of leading, you know, and how to stop. Yeah. Early Sunday morning, so too many people. Yeah, I suppose so. Thank you. Collected all them. I don't have a mark.
Godmorgen og velkommen. Mit navn er Jakob Mollerup, og derfor er jeg nødt til at starte med en rettelse. For alle, der interesserer sig for finansjournalistik, fallit staves med 2 L'er.
Failure.
Failure. Good morning and welcome to the Danish International Media Festival 2012. This could very well end up being an extremely interesting day. At least I can assure you that the beginning will be good. It's my privilege to introduce one of the first international keynotes, Dean Starkman from the windy city of New York. No sandy nor snowstorms have stopped him. It's great to have you here, Dean.
Welcome. Determined to be here. I made it.
You made it. Dean was an outstanding reporter for many years. For nearly a decade, he was a must-read in the Wall Street Journal. He was an acclaimed chief of the Providence Journal's investigative team. He is highly rewarded. I'll skip to mention the awards. Now he teaches at Columbia University and works for the Columbia Journalism Review. Probably the best journalism magazine around. Dean runs the audit, the sharp and provocative business press section of the magazine. He writes about the good and the bad and the ugly in business reporting. And he has written great stuff about why most media and most financial pundits fail to be critical, at least in public, about the events that led to the great crash in 2008. The world economy, surely including Europe, is still trying to recover from this historical setback, and many lessons from these events still have to be learned. Dean will give us an insight into what happens and how it was reported and not reported, and not least he will suggest how we can do better next time it's badly needed. Please welcome Dean Starkman.
Thank you, Jacob. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here in Odense speaking to this distinguished group of colleagues, my fellow journalists, and understand. And I want to thank Jacob for his amazing hospitality. You should have seen the dinner party they threw for me last night. It's a miracle I'm here this morning. I also want to thank the Danish Union of Journalists, and it's nice to be in a union setting for someone who was a union member for a long time. So I hope you don't mind, but since we're in a university town apparently, and it's early to get everyone woken up a little bit, and because I'm still jet lagged and feeling a little mean, I wanted to start you off with a quiz. This is a surprise examination, what we call in the States a pop quiz. It's multiple choice, and the grades will go on your permanent record, so do your best. And seriously, I want to talk about a quote that I came across, and you don't have to read it, and I'll read it for you, but I came across it and I wondered about it because it was practically one of a kind. So the question is, where did this passage appear and when? Quote, so by its very nature, the mortgage-backed securities market encourages lenders to make as many loans at as high an interest rate as possible. That may seem a prescription for frenzied and irresponsible lending, but federal regulations, strict guidelines by these agencies, intense and straightforward competition between banks and the relative sophistication of bank borrowers have kept things from getting out of hand, according to a government report. Now, these breaks don't apply as well in the subprime lending market, where regulation is looser, marketing more freewheeling, and customers less savvy. So, where did this appear? So you have 5 choices, and where and when? The Wall Street Journal, September 2008, after the Lehman crash. Was it in the Financial Times in May 2008, after Bear Stearns' The Wall Street Bank crash? Was it Handelsblatt in July 2007, when the cracks in the subprime market began to be appeared? Was it in Fund Stiftshund? No. Anytime. Or was it none of the above? And of course, everyone's figured it out. Actually, it appeared in December of 2004, all right? And it appeared in what can only be called a muckraking book, and it's called American Nightmare, Predatory Lending and the Foreclosure of the American Dream. It was written by Richard Lord, an urban affairs reporter, for something called the Pittsburgh City Paper. It's an alternative weekly in Pittsburgh, Eastern City. And who knew the subprime market and had been struck not so much by the predatory nature of the subprime lending business in the U.S., but by the fact that it was now going mainstream. It was becoming globalized. In the early 2000s, Lord, who had worked among other things as a farmer, he had no financial reporting experience, began to look into foreclosure filings at the Allegheny County Clerk's Office, which surrounds Pittsburgh. And he found that the numbers of foreclosures had doubled between 1995, remember these dates, a long time ago, 95 to 2000 and 2000, and that driving the spike were subprime mortgages, which is a relatively new product. He found anecdotal cases, of course, of mortgage abuse that are still hard to believe. He found one I remember was a 90-year-old man who was 90 pounds, about 45 kilos. He was impoverished, half blind, and he had been tricked into a high-rate mortgage by a company called Canseco. And he was living in a rooming. He was interviewed in a rooming house after his house of his lifetime home had been foreclosed. So then Lord began to look outside Pittsburgh, and he found similarly soaring foreclosure rates in other urban centers. Newark, I don't know, these are major urban centers: Newark, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago. And he was able to write this sentence: "The foreclosure tsunami suggests that the very concept of working-class home ownership could be in jeopardy." Now, this book is quirky and flawed. It's 230 pages, and it has no indexes or footnotes, not scholarly at all. It's sort of pastiche of anecdotes and charts and data and graphs, and even has a section of advice, what to do, literally, what to do if you have a subprime loan. But even so, the book is remarkable in the matter-of-fact way. It traces the chaos of the dilemma of this 90-year-old fellow and the spike in inner-city foreclosures in general, directly to the global mortgage-backed securities market and its sponsors on Wall Street. The book uses Federal Reserve data and mortgage trade publication data, stuff that is publicly available, to document a tenfold increase in subprime lending starting in mid-90s to 2003, which was the latest point when the data was available to him. And he also tracked a parallel rise in the securitization of subprime mortgages. So this is the heart, okay, of the global financial crisis. Where did he find it? He found it in Pittsburgh rooming house. Now, Lord, as I say, who heretofore had no financial reporting experience, was able, without much fanfare, to trace abusive lending practices to its source on Wall Street. Now, true, the book doesn't have the whole picture. You know, he doesn't write about collateralized debt obligations. He doesn't know about credit default swaps. But those are relatively new products, by the way, when he was writing this stuff. But he did understand that this was a big global business based on loans to people like this fellow, Mr. Blank, his name was, and the others he had met in inner-city Pittsburgh and rural Pennsylvania. He understood that the mortgage-backed securities market had been stable for years, but subprime was different. It was predatory lending and the foreclosure of the American dream, just as his title says it is. He also understood, moreover, the significance of such events as the acquisition in 2002 of a consumer finance company, a big one, called Household International, by a bank called HSBC in London. So this big global mega bank is now entering into lending to rural and inner city poor. Now, I would argue that Lord understood subprime as a societally dangerous phenomenon, largely because he had personally experienced it through the discipline of traditional newspaper reporting. He had walked the streets, he had knocked on doors, he sat with his notebook in hand, scribbling away, as the borrowers poured out their stories, their anxieties, their anger, and their sense of betrayal, but mostly their complaints about misrepresentations that they had received when they were getting their mortgages, frauds and flim-flams. This was reporting from the bottom up. Lord, you could say, it smelled the subprime market, and it smelled like an old rooming house occupied by a 90-year-old man. He was able to make the connection the mainstream media missed. And put it another way, because he understood the true and lawless nature of the subprime market, he recognized the need to trace its funding to its source. And so, with relative ease, he actually did. So, in the wake of the crash of 2008, there was an angry debate in the states that broke out over the role of the press in the lead-up to the meltdown. And critics contended that the business press had missed the story, been asleep at the wheel. Now, professional business editors, almost as a unit, rejected the charge, and they said they had in fact provided clear warnings. And they said, in fact, the failure had been on the part of readers who had missed the fantastic work that they had done. They hadn't been paying attention. One article, there was a lot of this. I could really make your blood boil, but one article sort of sums it up by a business press defender. He captured the dismissive attitude, but the first sentence was, anyone who's been paying attention has seen business journalism waving the red flag for several years. So in the spring of 2009, the Columbia Journalism Review, where I worked as an editor, undertook a project with a simple goal, to assess whether, in fact, the business press, as it contended, provided the public with fair warnings of looming dangers during the years when it actually could have made a difference. And I created a common sense list of 9 major business publications, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Fortune, etc. You can look it up if you Google CJR, the list, but I'll get to the methodology. That's where the methodology is. And with the help of 2 researchers, we used news databases to search for stories that could plausibly be considered warnings about the heart of the problem. Then we also asked the news organizations themselves for the best work during the period. And I think they thought it was some sort of contest. So they all kind of threw all their stuff at us, and it was great because it lent us a degree of confidence that we had their best. Anyway, so we created a database of our findings, and this is a screenshot. And it's got several hundred stories, but the only ones that count are the ones in red. Those are the ones we thought it was critical warnings. The result was Power Problem, published in CJR in the spring of 2009. Its conclusion was actually simple. The business press, we said, had, quote, done everything but take on the institutions that brought down the financial system. The record shows that the press actually published its hardest hitting investigations of lenders in Wall Street between 2000 and 2003, before the chaos. And for reasons that you'll have to read my book to understand, but then lapsed into useful but not sufficient consumer and investor-oriented stories during the critical years of 2004 to 2006. Missing were the investigative stories that confront directly powerful institutions about basic business practices, while those institutions were still powerful. And basically missing was the connection that Richard Lord made. So, to be exact, the U.S. financial press failure was a failure to perform accountability reporting on powerful financial institutions during these mortgage years, especially during, as I say, the last 3 critical years. And that's why the financial crisis of 2008 came as such a shock to the public and to the press itself. Now, accountability reporting. This is a journalism term of art. It's a shop talk among us, reporters and editors. But it's a term I would argue that the public and we all would need to understand better. Its absence left the public in the dark and powerless against a radicalized U.S. financial system in the years before the crash. And its future, during a period of media turmoil, is far from sure. Now, accountability reporting, as the name implies, the practice of holding powerful people and institutions to account in the public interest. It's something that many journalists talk about, but few actually do. Expensive, risky, and difficult, it has long tried the patience of news bureaucrats, bean counters, and cynics, many of whom would like to dispense with the practice altogether. It requires great reporters, courageous editors, and usually the support of a big bureaucracy. It takes time. Its value, while indisputable, is difficult to measure. So none of this is particularly compatible with the emerging digital news ecosystem that we're seeing now. And yet, it remains journalism's indispensable practice, job one. Walter Lippmann was one of the most brilliant journalism thinkers in the U.S. in the 20th century. In 1920, he wrote a critique of journalism called Liberty in the News. It was in response to the calamity of World War I and the widespread disillusionment of the existing institutions that followed. He was a subtle political observer, but he nonetheless put journalism, the journalism of his day, which was partisan, sensational, amateurish, at the center of the problem. He said, how, he wondered, can democracy function if the public, supposedly the ultimate decision maker, doesn't have the information it needs to cope with an increasingly complex society? So the quote, everywhere today, he wrote, men are conscious that somehow they must deal with questions more intricate than any church or school had prepared them to understand. Increasingly, they know that they cannot understand them if the facts are not quickly and steadily available. Increasingly, they are baffled because the facts are not available. He concluded memorably, "For an exact sense, the present crisis of Western democracy is a crisis of journalism." Even the crisis of 2008 and its aftermath can't be said to compare with the crises of Lipman's era, I suspect no one here, even today, 5 years later, needs many reminders of its consequences. That's to say it was bad enough. As in Lipman's era, our time too is marked by a general discrediting of important institutions, in our case, the ones that once dominated the financial landscape and made up the heart and soul of our financial system. To monitor these institutions that we now know were at best reckless, and in many cases, frankly corrupt. The public relied on an array of seemingly formidable news organizations, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Fortune, all the others under review today. These are members of a journalism subculture that touts its sophistication, sources and street smarts, and most of all, its mastery over a particular beat, finance. And yet, as I believe we've demonstrated in Power Problem, which you can read for yourself, in the run-up to the financial crisis of 2008, the business price failed in basic function. The watchdog didn't bark. What happened? And why was it that some journalists, mostly outside the mainstream, were able to produce work that in fact did reflect the radical changes overtaking the financial system, while the vast majority of the mainstream did not? It strikes me that some of the observations that Lipman made in 1920 are relevant today. He said, "It's not enough to struggle against great odds, wearing out reporters' souls to do a particular assignment well. The philosophy of the work itself needs to be discussed." And it needs to be discussed because of prior to the Great Crash, the press let the public down. But also the philosophy of the work needs to be discussed, and discussed now because the great crisis of the financial system coincided with an almost uncanny exactness with this mini-crisis that we've been experiencing in the journalism business. Between 2007, as everyone knows, the internet revolution wreaked havoc on the business models of news organizations almost across the board, resulting in near collapse of media company finances, by the end of the decade, which is something we're experiencing to this day. So fierce arguments, of course, are underway about the future of news. Who will do it? What will it look like? Who or what is this public now that we're supposed to be speaking to? Many among journalism in the U.S., at least, most prominently digitally oriented thinkers shed few tears for the problems of old media. And they proclaimed that the industrial era models have failed, both journalistically as well as financially. Rooted in digital culture, this intellectual vanguard advocates technologically driven models for the news that de-emphasize or dispense with altogether legacy news organizations and replace them with a decentralized network form of news gathering, one that dissolves the distinction between professional and amateur, between reporter and reader. These new models, moreover, de-emphasize or dispense with many traditional forms, including the story. And they favor a more informal, conversational discourse. In fact, these models even question the idea that there's such a thing as a public. And they favor a series of smaller network publics. Now, new technology indeed offers intriguing promise for network-powered, network-enhanced form of news gathering and distribution, of public engagement, and even of collective action. That this promise is yet to be realized is not a reason to dismiss it. But, as we'll see, the answer is not to throw out traditional journalism values, forms, and practices. The answer, rather, is to remember them, and to take and deploy the ones that worked in the public interest, and we can leave the rest by the wayside. Now, the book I'm writing, The Watchdog That Didn't Bark, The Financial Crisis in the Financial Press, is about a line of journalism practice that, over the course of a century, is demonstrated to be itself to be a powerful watchdog on behalf of the public interest. Accountability reporting is a subculture within journalism and a line of tradition that dates to the early 20th century and even before. It is, by definition, original and independent of the news preferences of powerful people and institutions. Its very function is to challenge authority, hold power to account, stick up for the little guy, and expose the gap between official discourse and the reality beneath. It doesn't follow official agendas, it sets its own. When done well, accountability reporting is a great democratizer of knowledge about technical but important subjects. It's a revealer of secrets and explainer of complex problems to the curious non-specialist. And that would be most of us most of the time. Indeed, it's when problems are most baffling, most complicated and worrisome, as they were in the financial system before the crash, that accountability reporting is at its best. Its main weapon is knowledge. Its main beneficiary is the public, which is also its best ally. Now, accountability reporting comes in many forms: a series of revelations in a newspaper or online, a book, a TV, magazine segment. But its most common manifestation has long been the long-form newspaper story or magazine story, the focus of my book. You can call it the great story or the great narrative. The form was pioneered in the U.S. by the Muckrakers in their quasi-literary work in the early 20th century. With the Ida Tarbell's expose on the Standard Oil Company of John D. Rockefeller, which eventually led to his breakup, the largest oil monopoly on the face of the earth, is sort of the most brilliant, shining example. This practice developed over time and has had to fight its way into the center of the journalism world. It's a fight that continues to this day. Now, the great story demonstrated its subversive power countless times, often and indeed usually in the face of opposition of powerful elites. It has exposed and clarified complex problems for mass audiences across a near limitless range of subjects, from graft in American cities to the crimes and cover-ups of media and political elites just last summer by Nick Davies and Alan Rusbridger and their colleagues at The Guardian with their work on Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. Now, it's also a great troublemaker, not just for its subjects, but within news organizations. It stresses the bureaucracy. It has no external constituency except the public in the most general sense. That is to say, it benefits everyone in general, but no one in particular. So it has difficulty justifying itself within news bureaucracy. And it's also difficult to find a market for it, for that reason. But as Lippmann suggests, without facts properly ordered and placed into context, the public is powerless and excluded from the workings of great institutions and helpless against their negative externalities. And with them, well, it's more than a match for Goldman Sachs and HSBC put together. Now, the term accountability reporting, of course, refers to an actual body of work, hundreds or thousands of newspaper and magazine stories, what scholars would call texts. They're reported by flesh and blood reporters working for imperfect, flawed institutions. But it's also an ideal, or an idea. It's a standard. It's an idea of journalism that can serve as a proxy for the good and valuable and the gusher of news that the public reads every day. Even more than a form or a set of techniques, accountability reporting is a worldview. It's a set of principles around which journalism can be organized. So, accountability reporting in practice was never perfect, we know that, and it never will be. But it is what journalism is supposed to look like when it's working right. Its presence is a sign of vitality and seriousness within a news organization and a news ecosystem. Its absence is a sign of unhealth. Now, the public needs to be included in the current conversation about journalism precisely because it was not included in the conversation about the financial system. Without some idea of what it needs, the public can have no idea how to get it. The urgent task now is to sort out what practices are important in order to improve on the news gathering and delivery systems that exist now, and to help guide its transformation. The only other choices are to chase the fashions of the moment or give up in despair. Now, to working reporters, what I say here may sound familiar, but as Lippmann suggests, the public is often the last to know. So these ideas are aimed both at journalists, but at anyone struggling to understand an increasingly complex and opaque society, one dominated by powerful and unaccountable institutions, and wondering why the news often falls so short. Now, business reporting is a sprawling endeavor populated by thousands of journalists with views across the political spectrum. And yet, business journalism, as evidenced by its output during the pre-crisis era, could be said to have missed the central story on its beat. There is a reason the business press and public were taken by surprise, just as there were a reason that a few outliers in the press, like Richard Lord, were not. Business journalism may be sprawling, but it's not static. It's getting a little worse. Norms and values change over time. You know, there are constant arguments, right, over in the field over what journalism is and what it's supposed to be. Now, one fundamental argument, I believe, is that between accountability reporting and what I call access reporting. which have competed for power and influence in the field since at least the early 20th century. These are competing sets of practices, worldviews, and journalism values that dramatically affect the content of the news the public reads. The access and accountability schools represent radically different understandings of what journalism is. The practices they employ produce radically different representations of reality, and these would prove critical in the run-up to the crash, I believe. So access reporting, by definition, emphasizes gaining inside information from powerful actors. It's stock in trade as the scoop, or exclusive, or beat, which delivers information about the actors' actions or intentions before they were widely known. In business news, the prototypical access story is the merger and acquisition scoop, news about pending business combinations. Now, accountability reporting, in contrast, seeks to gather information not from, but about powerful actors. The typical accountability story is a long-form expose. One way to think about the difference is that access reporting tells readers what powerful actors say, while accountability reporting tells readers what they do. I should add, there's an argument about this framing, of course, and the terms are very loaded. So access reporting is often used as an epithet, implying a kowtowing or stenographic relationship between reporter and powerful source. In other words, nobody introduces themselves by saying, "Hi, I'm Sam Schwartz, access reporter." But accountability reporting, meanwhile, sounds rather heroic. Everybody's for it. It's the mom and apple pie of American journalism debates. Those are the things everyone is for. But of course, talking about something and actually doing it are different things. So too are promoting news cultures that promote accountability reporting or discourage it, and creating news models that support it or make it all but impossible. Now, my background is in the former. I've done the latter. Both, as you'll see, are indispensable, but they perform different functions for different audiences. So, I'm not going to shy away from value judgments, but if we can leave them aside for a moment, I'd only suggest that it's impossible to understand business journalism of the mortgage era, where and how it failed, without understanding the dynamic between these competing tendencies. Wow. The public, after all, has only the words and images that journalism produces to rely on to know what the activities of the powerful and business institutions are up to. In the end, the rise of access reporting and the eclipse of accountability reporting during the pre-crisis era explains the public and the press's shock at the 2008 crash, and the fact that the public had little or no say in or idea about the radical transformation of the financial system beforehand. So I just want to break down these two definitions a little bit so you can see how these practices play out in real life. Now, we can think of the two tendencies as stools, each supported by different legs. A leg can be a practice or requirement or trait. Now, the access stool stands on, by definition, access to elite sources, usually leaders in powerful institutions. As a result, access reporting tends to transmit the views of the powerful. The media scholar Herbert Gans described this as top-down reporting. It also tends to deal in insider-oriented information about specialized subjects, like mergers and acquisitions. The audience is similarly narrow, the niche of people who follow these specialized areas. And further, the access style of reporting can be said to be driven not by news organizations, but by the institutions themselves. So powerful actors set the agenda. They make the news that news organizations report. So for all its appearance of activity and busyness, access reporting is paradoxically the more passive journalism form. As a result of all of the above, access reporting then can be fairly said to transmit conventional views. It's a conduit of orthodoxy. So finally, access reporting, I'd argue, is marked by a certain anti-intellectualism. It's a resolute, almost blinkered lack of curiosity about systemic problems and deeper questions that might be driving the day-to-day flow of news. So for the purposes of business reporting, access reporting would focus almost entirely on the interests of investors and insiders, but not those of the broader public. Now, in contrast, accountability reporting stool stands on and requires different things. The first is a broad view. Accountability reporting takes into its frame institutional or even systemic problems, like, say, political or business corruption, or global warming, for that matter. Since the problems are usually complicated, it usually needs space in a longer form of writing, often with narrative or storytelling elements. As a result, newsroom productivity pressures, the need for speed, work against accountability reporting, since because journalists need time for reporting, reading, sourcing, writing, rewriting, sometimes just thinking. The sources for accountability reporting are usually not elites, but rather dissidents, whistleblowers, plaintiffs, prosecutors, regulators, community activists, even business competitors. Often these are the losers or the victims in business or consumer settings. Indeed, rather than sources, elites are usually the subjects of accountability reporting. And such accountability reporting transmits views that can be described as heterodox. In the context of business news, accountability reporting speaks to the public. Public interest, often at the expense of investor or insider interest. So it's where one is sort of a pragmatic form and very useful, another is moralistic and in fact performance. I have to say also that accountability reporting, because it's expensive, time-consuming, and risky, is less accommodating to what we call news management and ownership preferences. Its support often stems from the ranks of news professionals, the newsroom. So there's a labor and management component to the access accountability dichotomy. And in this case, the public interest is usually aligned with labor. So I drew up just a simple graph just to summarize the things, because I think you can see, look, a lot of the, as we'll see, that a lot of the qualities that are required for the Access School have relevance for the digital ecosystem. So on one level, it's all journalism. And in practice, though, these two approaches lead to radically different representations of reality, radically different content. I mean, just to give you an example, here's Citigroup, reporting of Citigroup 2003 by an alternative weekly, not Richard Lawrence. A 7-month investigation by Sumner and Exposure uncovered a pattern of predatory lending practices within Citi subprime units. So they interviewed 150 people, activists, etc. The people and documents provide strong evidence that Citi's subprime operations are reaping billions in ill-gotten gains by targeting the consumers who can least afford it. So this is summer of 2003. Here's the Access view. Citi's chief hasn't just stepped out of his predecessor's shadow. He stepped out of his own as he strives to make himself a leader with vision. Business Week 2006, 3 years later. And the other one is from Fortune, same year. His 6'4" linebacker-esque frame, that's football position, is economically packed into a club chair in his palatial yet understated office. So, you know, these are, now, and if you go back and read these stories, they're not bad. There's not a fact error in them. It doesn't, they obviously didn't read this. But the point is, within the frame, it's great. It works perfectly well. And the thing about Citigroup, most misunderstood or overlooked bad bank probably in the world, you know, Citigroup was the driver of the mainstreaming of subprime in the U.S. It dominated, or had a huge chunk of subprime lending and the securitization. But it was also one of the most profitable companies in the history of public companies. In 2004, its profits were net income, $25 billion. Now that's oil company. At the time, it was a record in the history of U.S. public companies. Now, Exxon, a couple of years later, eclipsed it, but if you're looking at Citigroup from an investor point of view, you love it. You know, you love that bank. But that's why the frame is so inadequate. Even though these distinctions may seem, you know, sort of esoteric or overly philosophical, the fact is, this is the representation. I mean, it's fair. I read it. You know, read the record. This is the representation that was in the public arena prior to the crash. Of course, you're going to be surprised when the whole thing comes apart. Anyway, all this explains. You know, all I was just going to say, all this explains why Richard Lord and a few others could publish work based on a monumental array of meticulously gathered facts that expose the rising corruption of the financial system and its connection to Wall Street, While like a book like Too Big to Fail, which was this breakout bestseller by New York Times reporter Andrew Ross Sorkin, was also based on a monumental array of facts, also all accurate, which in the end, which provided a riveting insider's view, basically of heroic efforts of Wall Street figures to save the financial system. So both were accurate, but one view reveals what the other one conceals. So it's a question of seeing. What access reporting could not see, accountability reporting could only see. So now what? Much as the Iraq War did for the Washington Press Corps, the financial crisis of 2008 creates an opportunity for business news to rethink its mission and practices. Now that neither journalism subculture has taken advantage of this opportunity is to be regretted. For us, the crisis is an opportunity to re-examine business journalism, its mores and practices. And of course, business journalism can't be separated from journalism itself as it moves into the second decade of the 21st century. Old business models have been undermined. Once great newsrooms are in disarray. And now a flying squadron of bloggers and online analysts, many of them quite expert in matters of business and finance, now patrols the internet. So as I say, many have rushed forward with ideas about what journalism should do, what it should be. In the US Journalism Academy, these ideas have coalesced into something I call the future of news consensus, which has its roots in network theory. Some of these ideas I'll be talking about tomorrow at the university, if you're free. And some of these ideas are promising and have already been helpful, but on the other hand, it's been unnerving to witness how the internet's strengths, limitless space, a 24/7 publishing schedule, precise quantity and popularity metrics, have meshed with uncanny exactness with old-fashioned corporate imperatives of sped-up reporter productivity and indifferent journalism quality. You know, high-flown rhetoric about futuristic digital journalism has been deployed really in the US to justify cost cuts at regional newspapers and to marginalize reporting in the public interest. This is just the reality. So I'm going to argue in my book that digitally driven journalism, both in current theory and in practice, actually shares more traits with access reporting, those other things on the left, than it does with accountability reporting. And unless rethought, it represents a darkening cloud over the future of news. I just suggest that now is not the time for panic, not the time for chasing fads or for abandoning past practices just because they can't be totally done online. It's also not the time for clinging to old forms and business models and practices just because we're used to them. It's a time for discernment, and in some ways for hope. Now we have a chance to sweep away practices that didn't work and find new ones, but we shouldn't abandon something just because it's hard, or expensive, or risky. And we should insist that whatever the future of news, and whatever the medium, accountability reporting should play a central role, remain a core journalism practice. And we should not allow it to be pushed aside by old-fashioned corporate imperatives cloaked in digital rhetoric. We've already seen the consequences of what happens when the watchdog isn't barked. So thank you for your attention. I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dean.
Sure.
Before taking questions, I'd like you just shortly to elaborate on the Richard Lord's example you gave us. Why wasn't that kind of stories being picked up by the big media? Didn't they dare? Didn't they understand?
First, you'll absolutely have to buy my book to get the full end. But first, I have to finish the book. I think the answer is in this very crude chart because like I say, over time, norms and values change in our business. And sometimes things are in fashion, sometimes things are not. I think during like I said, during the mortgage era, there was three things that happened during the mortgage era. One was financial collapse of media models. Two was President George W. Bush, which basically collapsed regulation in the United States. And regulation and journalism, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, have this very interesting symbiotic relationship, and they actually work in a synergistic way. to help each other. So the lack of regulation really hurt. And it didn't bring up the problems that Richard Ord was discovering. And 3 was this kind of cultural shift toward, there's an increasing interest, I believe, in, or at least a narrowing of the definition of what business news is. What is business news? It's this. I mean, but it wasn't always that. It's one of the things I'm trying to do in my book is show that, this is business news as defined today, but, when Henry Luce started Fortune magazine in 1930, some of the things in there will stun you about how radical it was. They were dealing with the Great Depression, but Fortune was actually quite a radical voice. And Fortune today does this kind of stuff. And so who decides? Like, why is this? No one's arguing that this isn't good. That we don't need this. Of course we do. The question is, why is it confined to this? And if it's confined to this, you're asking for huge shocks like the one we just experienced. So.
I could think of 1 or 2 reporters from that time who would say, well, I read all the reports from the World Bank and from the central banks and from OECD, and when I re-examined what they said in 2007,
right,
none of them predicted what happened 1 year later. So why should I, as a reporter, be able to do it?
Precisely the OECD and the World Bank and the IMF, who are they talking to? They're talking to each other. And who are business reporters talking to? Them. But who was talking to Albert Blank, the 90-year-old? In other words, it really, at a time like this, it's time when elite institutions are really having trouble or blind to certain realities. It's really it becomes more imperative for journalism to kind of present the reality of the banking system and make them confront what's really happening in the system. So the thing about the financial crash, okay, the thing about a global GFC, guys call it over here, is that it's very complicated, of course, but we all know at this point it was based on mortgages in U.S. business, and mortgages are contracts made between individuals, and the subprime business is and always was in the U.S. a very tough business. It's never had a period where it wasn't scandal filled. It's a license for it's an asymmetrical market where the banks have all the information and the borrowers have none. So fraud comes part and parcel with subprime, and you could only know that if you were on the ground as a reporter. You would not know that if you're an analyst for the OECD or the World Bank or the IMF, because they were talking to the wrong people.
Interesting point. Well, who would like to come up with the first question? Yes, please. Just wait for the mic, please.
Hi, I'd like to know about what do you see as opportunities for accountability reporting when we look at the possibilities that social media and the digital reporting gives. What future do you see in using leveraging those media for this accountability reporting?
It's a great question, because the way it's framed, particularly because it's about leveraging these assets, and they are assets. These are not problems. Social media is a good thing, and Twitter I use all the time as a way of reading the best stuff on the web. The best example I could give you actually is the Guardian case. The Guardian case was interesting because that was for the most part, for years, it was an example of old-fashioned accountability reporting, where Nick Davies, I don't know how familiar you are with the story, but they were reporting that story from before 2009, and they were kind of lonely in the wilderness for a long time, rest of London media, British media, would stay away from it as far as possible because of the implications of the story, and they feared Murdoch and cultural problems and who God knows what. Okay. Well, then in, I think it was June or July of 2010, I want to say, 11, it was the Millie Dowler story. It was the story that they finally broke through to the public, grabbed the public's attention, where they found that not only had Murdoch's people been hacking phones, but one of them was the phone of a 13-year-old little girl who was missing, had been kidnapped, and had later was turned out to have been murdered. So this galvanized the public. And this has galvanized the public in a way that, in an age of social media. And so the role that social media played in that was really to amplify and the reporting that accountability did, and bring incredible pressure to bear on the British government, on News Corp. Social media could be credited with forcing the government to scrap the merger of B-Sky-V that Murdoch wanted. So that's an example of how it can really be deployed to leverage the impact of a newspaper story far beyond what the newspaper itself could do. Beyond that, it's like now it's a time for experimentation, and as I say, it's not about, it's very important for us not to look down on this stuff or reject it out of hand because it's new to us, we're not used to it, we don't come from that culture, but these things have enormous potential to actually help us do our job.
Okay, next. Yes.
Well, my personal understanding of this bad reporting of financial crisis has always been that it's due to lack of knowledge and lack of insight among journalists. But you are actually saying more or less the opposite, that, well, anyone without any experience could like Richard Lord, could do this, could make these warnings. So, well, I come to think, should we have a job swatch on the newspapers, or what role does it play in that? Whether you are experienced reporter within this, are you too covered of your own job of being too long in that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's again, if you're not careful and you're covering a subculture like business and finance, the walls of the beat begin to narrow, and it's defined by basically the institutions you cover, and it almost seems like a faux pas or kind of a bad manners to go outside and talk to dissidents and whistleblowers and people who are suing Citigroup, not the executives of Citigroup. And that's probably, that's precisely what I'm saying, that yes, I know it's the common understanding or belief that, if only we had more PhDs in math working for the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, they would have been able to deconstruct the models that underpin the collateralized debt obligations that brought the world to its knees. But but in fact, it was only the outsiders who really could see this. And the best example I could think of in this particular case is Gillian Tett. She's a Financial Times editor, but she was a reporter during this period, and she was covering gold. She was covering the bond market, and she was the one who first explored this whole brave new world of derivatives, which is kind of considered to be this incredible innovation that the financial sector was bringing to the world, and she was the only one who was credited with actually warning people about, this is a very strange market, there's big problems with it, I don't quite, we need to really, then after the crash, she was named British Journalist of the Year, and she's promoted, and she's a big star. Well, the interesting thing about Gillian Tett is that she's trained as an anthropologist, and her PhD her dissertation was on wedding rituals of Tajik tribesmen in Tajikistan. And when she talks, I know her, and she's giving speeches, she credits this background. She actually was kind of embarrassed about this PhD that she had. She never mentioned it when she was working there. She didn't think it was really relevant, but when she now reflects on it, she says it was really my background as an outsider, as a studier of subcultures, that allowed me to understand that this was something was the matter with the credit markets. Something was the matter. Gillian is a generalist, and that's, Richard Lord was a generalist. Ida Tarbell, who you don't know here, but she was like the greatest business reporter of her era and brought the monopoly to its knees, was a generalist. She had written historical narratives before. She'd never written a good business story in her life when she took on Standard Oil. So yeah, it's a great question. It's precisely what I'm saying. Yes, of course you need savvy and sophisticated people, but for the most part they're going to be worried about the left side of the equation. I'm not saying, again, I'm just saying you have to make room for the right side of the equation, otherwise we're going to have trouble.
Next. Anyone? Dean, could you tell us, have any of these big financial media learned anything from this? Admitted mistakes and?
Yeah, I mean, no one's really done the retrospective of, everyone did how the crash happened. Reading it was rather ironic. The Federal Reserve failed, the regulators failed, the Treasury failed, and the banks failed, and then Citigroup failed, and everyone was stupid, blind, or reckless, and couldn't see what was coming. But no, they didn't do the story about where we fit in. That's why I have a job, I guess. But there's two levels of answer to that. One is that that crash for us in the U.S. was so profound. It was completely stripped the veil off these institutions we've been covering for years. We all grew up covering Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch, and are they going to be better than Lehman Brothers? And next thing you know, they disappear. I mean, what? I mean, American International Group, AIG, iconic, powerhouse, untouchable. It was the Death Star of the financial world. Gone. What? For me, that was sort of like, that was the thing. So yeah, there was this kind of, it was a galvanizing moment. But unfortunately, from what I can tell, we've kind of gone back to business as usual. And what I'm trying to argue, and I'm not sure, we'll see how well these ideas, I can do with them. But I'm trying to argue that, the digital culture holds, like I say, a lot of promise. We should embrace it, but a lot of its characteristics are really not favorable to the stuff that we need to do, and we need to understand that and clear a space for things that are serious. So, it's been a very attentive audience. I really appreciate your.
There's last question. Anyone? Nils?
Yeah, just wonder if you are positive or negative next time we face a financial crisis, or some government claiming that they have weapons of mass destruction and we need to invade them, or some other big problems we don't report to the public. Will we be capable of doing it next time, or will we fool the public?
I mean, one of these great quotes by Marshall McLuhan was that nothing is inevitable if we're if we're conscious about what's happening, and to a large degree, we're all kind of caught up in this digital transformation, and we don't have a say exactly on where it's going to go, and we have to work within structures that we didn't create. However, from what I understand, the Danish journalism tradition is very independent and free-thinking, and has actually a lot more power, as we were discussing in the car. And we have a lot more power than the U.S. newsrooms currently have vis-a-vis management and outside. So, you know, we also have to be conscious, you know, of what's happening. And again, like what Lipman said, you know, struggling against great odds, trying to do a story today, you know, that's what we do, and it's important, but it's also important for us to step back and make sure that, you know, that the more serious, that another tradition, you know, is also being attended to, and that we have cleared a space for, you know, the kind of generalist accountability reporting that's going to help, you know, prevent, you know, the outsider view that's going to help prevent fiascos like the Iraq War, or at least push back against, you know, those kind of memes, or provide an alternative view to the view of Citigroup that we had before the crash.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
In just before closing, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that barking watchdogs and people in favor of accountability journalism will be talking in this room for the rest of the day, presenting their projects, which are all projects that have been nominated for the prize, FUJ prize, that will be given out tonight. And if you are interested in this Danish Association for Investigative Journalism, I think there will be information material to be found in the back of the room. But Dean, thank you very much, and please finish your book very soon.